Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the world you might be. I am Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to what I am confident will be an exciting and provocative discussion, which is part of our book series In Conversation With, a joint production with our partner, Columbia University Press. Today, Bashir, Associate Professor of Political Theory at the Open University of Israel and a Senior Research Fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and Layla Farsakh, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, will join in a conversation with Peter Beinart and myself. Mr. Beinart, who will be moderating our discussion, is a New York Times contributing columnist, a courageous, if not fearless, and progressive political commentator, former editor of the New Republic, and editor of the Beinart Notebook. It's really a privilege to welcome you all and to have you with us, Peter. Doctors Bashir and Farsakh are the editors of the Arab and Jewish Questions, Geographies of Engagement in Palestine and Beyond, a new multidisciplinary volume comprising the work of a diverse and thoughtful array of experts, plus an introductory essay by the editors. I would like to begin by simply expressing my appreciation for the book's title and its destabilization of problematic and pejorative phrases. The Jewish question or the Arab question that implicitly reify monolithic ideas of identity, while also suggesting that the identity is somehow suspect, representing a problem to be solved. The phrases are relics of colonialism, and when the authors link them explicitly to an engaging geography, they are turned on their heads. An eternal, insoluble question becomes human, relational, and changing, tied to the land, a land which happens to be the geography of my ancestors and the birthplace of both of my parents. Thus, I am grateful for this important work, addressing themes both acutely personal and of enduring professional interest. My enthusiasm for the title reflects the heart of the story, the deconstruction of this pernicious idea that there is a single Arab identity, as if context, setting, adjacency, and history were irrelevant to the formation of who we are and who we become. There is probably nothing more important to me than disentangling these tropes of identity, and this is certainly not merely personal. The tragedies engendered by this way of thinking are innumerable, destructive beyond measure, and have grown more virulent over time. Today's emboldened nationalism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia, and the exploitation of differences among people who also share a great deal, who inhabit the same spaces and have endured the same struggles, are all products of this manufactured notion of the Arab and the Jew, and with it, the denial of Palestinian identity, turning Palestinians into Israeli Arabs as a way of denying any claim to the land or to a Palestinian nationhood. A Palestinian becomes simply an Arab, belonging to a fabricated group, interchangeable rather than a specific people with a unique identity and relationship to the land. Now, I don't know if Christianity's role in creating these problems was intentionally foreshadowed by Bashir and Layla's essay in the book entitled Three Questions That Make One, but it seems a brilliant and necessary link to take the Israel-Palestine question, the Arab-Muslim question, and the Jewish question as historically connected to the way Christianity identified Islam and Judaism as other, linking the two as outside of the realm of citizenship, and then exporting them as problems to the Middle East. The resultant construct of national identity and geographic boundaries ends up defining the region, depriving its inhabitants of their rich, complex, and true identities. So much is erased. The photograph from a few years back of Netanyahu and Macron embracing, celebrating what the Jewish state and the new Europe mean to one another documents who was not present. Such festivities require the invisibility of the Palestinian people, as Brian Klug argues in his chapter's contribution to the book. There is something of the flaneur in the way I am processing this material, wandering the halls of memory and experience, observing carefully, but with slight estrangement, one which belies an investment in the issues of the dispossessed. I am not interested in romanticizing notions of belonging, but it is my belief that the sense of wholeness, the diverse humanity and genuine complexity this book acknowledges in people that have too often been reduced to something else, is essential to the work before us. That of coming to terms with the past and facing our histories in order to build a more just future. Let us begin. Peter, over to you.
Thank you. I'm honored to be able to be part of this conversation. Leila, I thought I would start with you. I just want to read you a couple of sentences from the introduction. You write, you and Bashir write, no study has explored the intersections between the rise of Islamophobia in the West, the failure to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the political meanings of the Arab uprisings. Neither have many scholars examined how these developments are tied to three seemingly unrelated questions, namely the question of Israel-Palestine, the Arab-Muslim question, and the Jewish question. These questions, this book argues, are not only entangled, but also belong to the same history. So can you just talk a little bit about the ways in which these three questions are entangled and why you thought it was so important to address them together?
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you, Safwan, also for this excellent introduction of the book. Yeah, that's exactly what was our objective, is to put two questions which have often been discussed, but separated, arguing the Jewish question, which is the question of what are the rights of the Jews in Europe that rejected them, and the Arab question, which was the question of what are the rights of the Palestinians and Arab once Zionism sought to create a state on the land of Palestine. And what we try to show in this book is that these two questions actually are not separate. They belong together in three fundamental ways. They're tied in a fundamental way, in a historical sense, in a political sense, and also in a visionary sense. So the first element was to show how the Arab and Jewish questions are really tied to the same history, a history which is tied to Europe, a Europe that could not deal with an other, which in the 19th century, this other was the Jew, and in the 20th and 21st century, this other becomes the Muslim. So the Arab and Jewish question are thus tied to Europe's failure to deal with the problem and the right of the other, be it Arab or Muslim, Jewish, Polish, immigrant, questions that are still with us today. So that's the first thing. And also how Europe, who did fail to deal with the problem of the other, on the right of the other in the 19th century, transported this problem to the Middle East and tried to solve it through colonialism. So there we come to the second dimension, the centrality of colonialism to Europe's identity, an identity it fails to deal with, and how the problem of colonialism is at the heart of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So this goes again at how the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Jewish question, the Arab question, Islamophobia are tied. Secondly, the issue is that the Arab and Jewish question are linked together politically. They both are concerned with how do you define the right of the other, be it the Israeli, be it the Palestinian, be it the Muslim, be it the Christian, be it the Yemeni, be it the Yazidi. So in other words, how can we have a political structure in the 21st century that recognizes the other rather than essentializes their identity, as Safwan said, rather than having a generic identity called Arab or generic identity called Jewish or generic identity called Israeli. So in other words, it's a way by which to try and think of political rights as universal, as based on equality, and of identity as multi-layered, in which we confront the history rather than deny it. And a history that's very rich, by which we try to look at the figure of the Arab Jew as emblematic of how nationalism as a political solution has been problematic because it eradicates identities that are much more complex. So the Arab Jew represents how Zionism decoupled and denied its Arab origin, and Arab nationalism tried to deny the role of the Jew, Arab Jew in the Middle East. And thirdly, what this book tried to do was putting the Jewish and Arab questions together, is show how we need to go beyond partition. So it's a critique of nationalism as a project which has failed, Arab nationalism, which is also at the core of the Arab uprising, the failure of state nationalism that ostracized and oppressed rather than liberated and gave rights, to try and think of what is a new political structure that goes beyond partition rather than things in partition, in order to allow all those who live on the land have equal rights without privileges or priorities over others. So that's really how it is tied together. I hope this answers your question.
Bashir, let me turn to you. I have this book, it seems to me, continues work that you have been doing on the interaction between Jewish and Palestinian identity and Jewish and Palestinian history. And I have to say, I found the book that you co-edited on the Nakba and the Holocaust to be deeply moving, among other things. And I wanted to ask you a little bit, as a Palestinian, why you think it's important to engage with the history of anti-Semitism, and what are some of the challenges in doing that, as someone who is now lives as a as someone without full rights in a Jewish state that legitimizes itself in many ways by reference to that history that you are trying to explore.
Okay, thank you, Safwan. Thank you, Peter. So let me start with the first part of your question about how we were to contextualize this specific project about the Arab and Jewish question in a larger picture of intellectual interest here. And here we need to see this project as related to two other pillars, and these three pillars together really compose some very interesting intellectual intervention of some sort that has some political peering. And we have got this alternatives to partition component, where we produced a book at the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue in Vienna, which we are very grateful because they also hosted this group that produced the Arab and the Jewish question, which is basically an attempt to go beyond and interrogate the issue of partition, territorial partition, but not only territorial, as a paradigm within which we can really articulate, explore the question of Palestine, Israel. So this is one thing. And the second thing is really the histories of the Holocaust and the Nakba, and the intersecting and intertwined relationships between the Holocaust and the Nakba. And and these are very fundamental components that I think would be a very, it would be a pity not to understand them as to be the underlying factors that inform substantive issues that relate to Israel-Palestine. But I think it would be a failure, or it would be a limited understanding if we were to narrow our focus on these without really expanding this to interrogate Europe, where many of these questions have started through their colonial intervention, through their dismissiveness and denial of Palestinian nationalism, and through the legacy of anti-Semitism. And this takes me to the second part of your question in relation to the interest of the Palestinians in anti-Semitism, and actually the Palestinian kind of sentiment that I feel about the need that the Palestinians engage in the fight against anti-Semitism. And that is partly has to do with the fact that the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Jews at large, I would say, have become intertwined in a way that they have become inseparable. I don't think today there is any Jewish position of any particular point of view that can really engage in a consistent ethical way without really engaging with the Palestinian question. And in a tragic, paradoxical way, the Palestinians have become an integral part of the Jewish modern history through the Nakba. I mean, this is exactly the intertwinement that I try to do with my colleague and friend Amos Goldberg from the Hebrew University in the book that we produced also through Columbia on the Holocaust and the Nakba. So the question of anti-Semitism is a question that is an extremely key point to understand, that actually that Europe's failure to integrate the Jews, as Layla has said, through the drive of the modern nation state for purity and homogeneity is an alarming, interesting turning point in understanding the modern kind of context through which also you understand the rise and the development within Jewish kind of identity and politics that led, among other things, to Zionism. And we need to be very careful, as you probably know very much in your work. We shouldn't reduce Jewish existent modern life only to the frame of Zionism. But the Palestinians as the victims of Zionism, as the victim of settler colonial enterprise that was sponsored by Europe, their engagement with that is also through trying to understand beyond just victimhood, but also through empathy, through understanding, through digging deep into the roots of this, not for the sake of any form of normalization, but actually for the sake of seeking normalization through decolonizing process and through conditionalities that are put there, which address Palestinian refugees, questions Palestinian color, the Palestinian ongoing Palestinian Nakba, etc., etc. So this is partly, why the fight against anti-Semitism is extremely critical to the Palestinians, and it's extremely critical historically and ethically. And in that sense, the Palestinians obviously are very, very careful also to criticize the Zionist use and abuse of anti-Semitism to criminalize and to criminalize and silence the Palestinians, which is an extremely alarming development. So this is briefly how I can see these things linked together in the context of these three projects. That again, these three projects really make one project, as the three questions make one question.
Leila, I'd like to go back to Europe, which is you kind of in some ways you start the story, and you talk about both the European unwillingness to create a political vision that offers Jews equality as the Jews who live in Europe internally, and also the way in which Europe begins a process of colonization based on certain notions of also of unwillingness to offer equality to Arabs and certain notions about, let's say, Islam. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between the way that you see Europe relating to Jews, and again back in the, let's say in the 19th century, and the way in which it relates to Arabs in the Arab world.
Okay, this is a very complicated question, okay, because it needs to be historically contextualized, and I think this is very important. The Jewish question is a question that emerged, as you know, in the 19th century. Okay, and the answer that Zionism proposed to it is the state. But many other Jews, including Zionists, did not propose a Jewish state. People like Hannah Arendt, people like Ahad Aham, people like Judah Magnus proposed rather the argument that the Jews constitute a nation, in again the spirit of the time, and they don't need a state to exist. What they need is a home. So Europe was the problem of Zionism, that it is a 19th century, 20th century solution. And as Hannah Arendt, in one of her best articles in 1945, called Zionism Reconsidered, she said Zionism is offering a 19th century solution to a 20th century problem. And basically her argument was that the nation state is a problem. The nation state by definition excludes. The nation state cannot be a solution to any discrimination because it's going to lead to other discrimination. What you need to do is a state of rights, a state that protects the rights of everybody under its territory to have equal rights, and they can live with their collective and individual rights. So I see Europe as being the problem because, I mean, it's the solution of the nation state is a historically constituted solution. But Europe has been colonial before Zionism and after Zionism. Zionism wanted to be a European project. They will have no, if you read Herzl, you read Ben-Gurion, you read all Jabotinsky, they were all very clear that project is colonial. And actually it was good to be colonial because it is modern to be colonial. So the fundamental issue is the problem of modernity and how the solution to modernity at the time, or the emblematic example of modernity, was the nation state. As we go into the 20th century, we realize that Zionism could not have been created without colonialism. So the answer to the Jewish question could through a nation state is colonial. And the one who financed this project is colonial power, Britain, okay, and France, and the US afterwards. So the problem, and also how the problem of the Holocaust, the guilt that Europe felt towards the Jewish question, and how the Holocaust is the epitome, the example, the best example of the extremity of what a nation state brings to, and how it not only ostracized the Jews who consider themselves European, but also created one of the major genocides, who's the one who paid for it was the Palestinian. And this doesn't mean that it's not a great tragedy. Of course it is. But it shows how Europe, it's again emblematic of how Europe cannot face the other and has a very narrow definition of what European is. And Europe is unable today to deal with its colonial legacy. So today we're dealing with the problem of the legacy. What do you deal with the colonial legacy? Do you incorporate a larger definition of the self? A Frenchman can be Muslim. A Palestinian can be Jewish. A German can be Turkish and Muslim. Do you have this larger incorporation of a European definition of the self? Or do you keep it to be a European Christian definition in a very narrow sense? So that's with regards to the problem of Europe. Now, Islamophobia exemplified again how Europe still is unable to embrace a larger definition of itself as a multicultural entity that is not based on a Judeo-Christian tradition, as some claim. This is part of its history, but it can also claim a different history, which is also Muslim, also cosmopolitan, also international, and one that deals with the colonial legacy that Europe still did not deal with, especially, So I think that's where Europe is. I mean, and also the hegemonic power of Europe and the West in general. I mean, still, imperialism is not over. Okay, we have a slogan of rights, but a reality of realpolitik where we still are dealing with domination.
Bashir, Layla was talking about a state of rights, and you've done a lot of work, as you mentioned, on thinking beyond partition, thinking about integrative solutions that are based on rights for all as a possible way forward in Israel-Palestine. And I wonder where do you find models that one can look to and draw upon for what Hannah Arendt was talking about a state of rights rather than a state which is narrowly built around a particular nationalist or ethnic or religious conception.
Okay, so I mean, there are many models and there are multiplicities of layers of analysis. The question is which model that you are examining in reference to what is the question that this model is trying to answer. Mm-hmm. And here I think we will have to be very careful to distinguish between the entry to the conversation when we speak about rights. And here I think there is a very important distinction that we need to draw, despite the fact that usually they are used interchangeably. And in the context of Palestine, Israel, in a post kind of partition or in a post-partition imagination, there is a difference with the entry that speaks about individual right or one person, one vote, and between the entry that speaks about bi-nationalism. I mean, sometimes these are being used interchangeably, but I want here to argue that these are very different creatures. The minute we speak about the entry of individual rights and one person, one vote, there are many examples. The South African example is one where you have a decolonization process that put an end to, with all the complications that come without romanticizing South Africa. That is an entry of itself. That's a very interesting entry that speaks about individual liberal rights. In the case of Israel-Palestine, the difference, among several differences that relate to Israel-Palestine, in comparison to the South African case, has to do with the fact that actually we are talking in the case of Israel-Palestine about two national groups. Now, these two national groups already complicate the story, and this is why the entry of bi-nationalism here is much more successful. Now, the minute we start talking about bi-nationalism as a descriptive account of referring to the facts on the ground of the existing of two national parallel groups, one settler colonial enterprise that produced this national Jewish Israeli identity, and a Palestinian indigenous group that has its own national movement with the various differences between them. The entry to this conversation is very different. And here the models become very different because the models here start talking about bi-nationalism, multinational. And this is why the types of solutions that you really relate to are very different also constitutionally, because the minute you speak about individuals, then there is no need for any serious federation of anything that is a post-partition issue, because we speak here about forms of liberal democracy or constitutional liberalism that can manifest itself with the extreme manifestation of it in multicultural form of thing. That's a different setting than when you speak about bi-nationalism as an ethical entry and a descriptive reality. Ethical meaning the way that you are aspiring to transcend the Jewish supremacy that exists today in the land through its control and oppression of the Palestinian in a form of a complication of an apartheid with occupation and settler colonial enterprise, that you want to transcend that through actually seeking not a de facto rigid bi-national reality, but actually an egalitarian. You want to seek to drive towards egalitarian form of bi-nationalism. Our work, whether that is with Amos Goldberg or with what I did with Azar Dakwar at the Kreisky Forum in the Partition and its alternatives, and here with Leila Farsakh at very important chunk of the book, tries to address these questions. And now the question of model becomes really, there are multiplicities of examples that you can go all the way from Canada. The overwhelming majority of actually established democracies, whether these are actually settler-based democracies or not, the overwhelming majority of them are actually multinational in nature. And this is why these countries actually, with a few exceptions, have actually federations, confederations, or any other kind of constitutional designs to respond. Now, in the context of Israel-Palestine, and obviously by extensions in the context of the Arab world, which is, as Safwan was saying, part of what we try to do is also interrogating Arab nationalism, because it assumed this assimilationist form of vulgar nationalism. That I'm not suggesting that all Arab nationalism are vulgar and assimilationist, but there are very serious strands and variants that try to do. But that wasn't your question. Your question was in relation to what we speak about post-partition in the context of Israel-Palestine. And I want to conclude in the context of speaking about bi-nationalism, as you demonstrated in one of your articles recently as well, that once we speak the language of bi-nationalism and nationalism, we are already engaged with the conversations of rights, but in collective way, meaning that we are not talking about individual, but also about collective national rights. And here, I'm not really worried, because one of the challenges that my students and my conversation with my Israeli colleagues and my Israeli interlocutors, about some of the very serious differences but also, serious differences about when we speak about these kind of questions. I am not really concerned about which model we are aspiring to in relation to whether there are models, because one typical challenge to these types of ideas, and I side bi-nationalism. Let me just be very clear that I think the way forward is the ethics of bi-nationalism that is premised on equality, parity, mutual legitimacy under conditions of decolonization, of historical reconciliation and decolonization in Israel-Palestine. So, the challenge often is, where do you have these examples?
Right.
Well, there are multiple. Canada is one example. Switzerland is one example. Again, we are not really looking for a copy, because Palestine and Israel has got its own specificities. Therefore, I'm not really worried about neither having constitutional engineering and designs in labs, nor I am worried about Israel-Palestine being a pioneering model that might develop into history. These are going to be determined by the very concrete specificities and the struggle for equality and ending Jewish supremacy and Jewish privileges and any form of a Jewish exclusive rights in historic Palestine. The result is going to be is going to be emerging from the very concrete reality of the ground.
Right. Leila, the book is not called The Palestinian and Jewish Questions, it's called The Arab and Jewish Questions. And you are clearly want to talk, as Bashir was saying, about Arab nationalism and put that in conversation with these questions as well. And the piece talks, responds to the historical moment of the Arab Spring and the Arab uprising in 2011. But I wanted to, since perhaps since you finished the book, we've had this another development, which is the normalization between Israel and some various Arab governments, which some herald, as some kind of move towards a more, tolerant and pluralistic and, et cetera, Middle East, although one can have one's skepticism about that. But I would just interesting to ask you how you would incorporate this new geopolitical development, this rise of this geopolitical axis between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, and maybe the Saudis as a kind of anti-Iranian kind of axis. How does that fit into the analysis here?
It fits very brilliantly, because it shows you the link between authoritarian regime and colonial regimes. No, it shows that the alliances between oppressive regimes or undemocratic regimes and colonialism, even if it is a democratic colonialism for Jews in Israel, it showed the conversions of interest. I mean, the Arab uprising was very important because the Arab uprising showed that for once, the people have shifted from wanting to capture the state. The debate was not over whether the state is going to be Islamic, un-Islamic, Marxist nation or not nation. The Arab uprising was about people going out in the street and saying, we have rights. And the responsibility of the state is to protect citizens' rights. And that's a fundamental, scary demand by that any oppressive regime faces, any authoritarian regime, because it's asking the state to be accountable, it's asking rulers to be accountable, it's asking equality between everybody. And that's central now. The counterattack to that has been an incredible, as you know, and the response to the Arab uprising has been incredibly violent. And it's been incredibly violent because it has shifted the discourse. We are not in questioning the state. The state has to exist. Nobody wants to capture the state, but we want rights. We want equality. We want no longer oppression. So now that is fundamental to us. It's just to show you again how there is a questioning of Arab nationalism, or if you want, there's a reclaiming of Arab nationalism, which is not the hegemonic state discourse that eliminates identity or associates identity that we have now with Sunni and Shia identity in the Middle East, rather than Arab or Persian identity. Or we try to say now that the Jews become our cousins, as the United Arab Emirates argues, okay, but the Shia are an enemy, which is just totally how geopolitics works. It's a question of interest, it's a question of oppression to keep certain privileges at the expense of others. So actually the Abraham Accords are very interesting because they just show you, on the one hand, the alliance of interest between oppressive regimes, and it's also pushing the debate that the problem has never been about the Jews. Jews have always been part of the Middle East. The question has always been about colonialism and inequality and oppression. And in that line of oppression, it's not the monopoly of just the Zionists. It's the monopoly of any oppressive regime who doesn't believe in equality of rights.
Can I come on this, if I may?
Please.
Let me take this back to why I think the entry of bi-nationalism remains to be very interesting as an intervention, politically, conceptually, historically, and ethically in this. One of the most remarkable things that Zionism has achieved for Israeli Jews, and maybe for other Jews, but for Israeli Jews, is that actually they turned into really this national kind of making of identity, which basically, and it managed, like Zionism really is a European phenomena. The Jewish question is a European thing. Zionism is a response to a European thing. And this is the Zionists continue to tell themselves that they are a villa in the jungle of the Middle East. So they continue to aspire to be part of Europe. But one of the most fascinating things that is Zionism did succeed in a very remarkable way to create this Jewish national identity or Jewish Israeli national identity. But Zionism, apropos normalization, has failed miserably to deliver on two things. One is achieve normalization and legitimacy in the eyes of its victims. Israel is mighty, Israel is successful, Israel is having very serious negotiations with Arab regimes. Palestine as a central question for geopolitical is decreasing its significance, but there is one remaining fact, and that is in the eyes of the Palestinians, who are almost now half of the population between the river and the sea, and soon will be the majority. In the eyes of the Palestinians, this whole entire colonial enterprise and the existence is questionable and lack any serious form of normalcy and legitimacy. And this is also demonstrated in the very disruptive encounters when an Israeli encounter a Palestinian. You can feel it. It doesn't matter how many Arab regimes, it does matter for some geopolitical interests of some sort and concrete political things that might transform reality. I don't deny that. But in the eyes of the Palestinians, as far as the Palestinians are the victims and they are colonized, and there is no coming to terms, as Safwan was alluding earlier, to the past and the ongoing consequences of that past, i.e. the Nakba, the Palestinian refugees, etc., and the decolonization, which will lead to dismantling any form of Jewish exclusivity in any fashion, whether that is self-determination or sovereignty. I have no problem with Israeli Jewish sovereignty in Palestine. I have no problem with Israeli Jewish right for self-determination in Palestine, conditional that is not exclusive, and that will have not to be cashed out in a form of a vulgar ethno-national form of Jewish state, the way we know it from the establishment until today. The normalization and the legitimacy that Israelis fundamentally lack, and that is something that Israelis will acknowledge that they lack. That is legitimacy in the eyes of the occupied and the oppressed and the victim. That is the Palestinian, whether that is a Palestinian refugee in Jordan or in diaspora or in Sakhnin or in Haifa or in Al-Fahim or in Nazareth or in Ramallah or in Gaza. There is a very serious, profound, disruptive issue of contact that in the lack of the Palestinian full rights, regardless the solution in that matter, the Palestinians will not grant that legitimacy and that normalization. This is why what I try to do with Amos Goldberg in the Holocaust and the Nakba, to see how nevertheless you can go to the most painful memories and account for Europe's history and responsibility, through which you can really tackle these fundamental issues in order to move forward to a situation where you gain legitimacy normalization through the question of parity and national rights, that ought not to be translated and cashed out in exclusive, vulgar, ethno-national state, the way the state of Israel is demonstrating itself since its establishment until today.
Leila, I wanted to talk about, Bashir made the point that no matter what Israel might be able to achieve, it cannot achieve the acceptance of Palestinians while it denying them rights. And I think one of the reasons perhaps that many Israeli leaders and supporters of Israel right now feel that they can essentially be dismissive of this, as they go about forging relationships with various Arab regimes or other regimes around the world, is the state of the Palestinian national movement. And I have to say, as an outsider to that movement, one of the challenging things about interacting and learning from it and engaging with it is a kind of intellectual discourse, about rights and equality and integration, and yet a political leadership. I mean, I think there was just news, I think in the last couple of days, that according to the PLO, that Hamas has now accepted the two-state solution. And so I wonder if you can talk about the Palestinian national movement at this moment politically, its leadership, and how it fits in with this analysis.
Okay, the Palestinian national movement is in crisis, like every national movement in the region. Okay, so, and I think it's emblematic of the crisis we are in. Okay, the Palestinian national movement has opted for the two-state solution, has argued the need for a state in order to exist as Palestinians, also delivered on that level. The Israeli today recognize that there is something called the Palestinians and that the Palestinians have some right. But what also ended up doing is trying to dissolve the Palestinian problem after it recognized it. So it's very important that Zionism admitted the existence of the Palestinian people with Oslo. Okay, but what Zionism tried to do, instead of implementing a two-state solution, which many argue would have been the best thing, including Rabin, would have been the best solution to Israel, Zionism could not deal with that. Fundamentally, the version of Zionism that won is now, we're gonna dissolve the Palestinian problem. And now with this, what Netanyahu would argue on a realpolitik point of view, that version of Zionism won because Arab countries are willing to give up the Palestine question for the sake of their state survival, because of security coordination, because of common economic and political interests. So the Palestinian nationalism movement today is confronting the challenge of they exist on the ground. They are dealing with a settler colonial state which is stronger. Israel is the only sovereign in the land between the river and the sea. Israel is an apartheid state. And the project of the nation state played its role. It's over. Its role was to get international recognition of the Palestinian. It obtained it, but the implementation of the two-state solution is in the hand of an international community that can impose it, or Israel to implement it. And Israel is not interested in it. Israel proved that the two-state solution became a Bantustan solution. Okay, and once you are in a Bantustan reality, in Bantustans in South Africa, the South African regime recognized the independence of the Bantustans in 1970. The Bantustans lived 20 years. They had autonomy not dissimilar in any way to what the Palestinians had. Okay, what needed is an alternative national project. Now, you don't have it yet, this alternative political project. It is, in my view, in fermentation. You hear it more and more, okay? But to translate the idea that Bashir was talking about of a binational state, of a solution beyond partition, what we have now is that the two-state solution is dead, but the alternative as a political strategy is not yet articulated. And the reason why it is not yet articulated, because it is difficult, because you're confronting a challenge at more than one level. Okay, you need a legal structure, and we have a legal structure that recognizes two-state solution. This is obsolete now, so you need an alternative to it. And secondly, the necessity to revive, and what is what happened over the past 20 years, the discourse of decolonization. And Israel is very scared of a discourse of decolonization. And during the two-state solution, also we did not talk about decolonization. We talked about, okay, this is Zionism, this is Palestinian nationalism, two states, that's all. Given that Israel did not implement the two-state solution, it became fundamental to talk about either apartheid or decolonization, which is the same thing. So in that respect, what the work I'm doing, Bashir is doing, many people are doing, is precisely as Palestinian, to define what this political alternative is. And as Bashir said, an ethical political alternative that talks about the right of everybody. But this is a question that also revealed that finding a solution to Palestine, liberating Palestine, decolonizing Palestine, is also tied with decolonizing or liberating the Arab world. So the question of Palestine is again becoming an Arab question, as a grassroots question, as a rights question. What we're confronting is the masses versus the states, the oppressive state versus the people wanting their rights. We cannot solve the problem of Palestine without solving the problem of the civil war in Syria. We cannot solve the problem of Palestine without solving Iraq. Okay, and we cannot solve Iraq without solving, the alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So it's the geopolitics versus the ethic of what is correct and the economic possibility of an alternative. So we are in a phase of what Gramsci would say that we are in a morbid state that the old is dead, the new is not yet born. But there are lots of it's the new discourse that we are trying to push for, which is a discourse of equal right and decolonization. And decolonization involves an engagement with the self, with the oppressor, and with the victim. But the victim is not unique. The victim is not just the Zionist. The victim is not just the Palestinian. The victim is not just the Syrian. All of us are victim. We are victim of an oppressive system that we need to challenge. And seeing these intersections and working on them to have a new political structure that enshrines equality is what we're working on at all levels. But it's on the short run, so the Palestinians are just, in my view, the Palestinian national movement is playing in what we call the lost time. And what we're doing with Palestinians are emphasizing their presence, their existence, but they're unable to come up about with an emancipatory political project because it needs to be connected with the regional and international context, like the PLO did in the 1960s. We forget that. The PLO, the Palestinian question was also absent on the international scene between 1948 and 1967. But the Palestinian question became the issue by 1974 when Arafat was invited to the United Nations. That because it came at a juncture where the regional, international, and local forces interacted together in a progressive agenda of national liberation. National liberation moving forward will not mean the same thing as in the past. What it means is how you're going to create a state of rights and how you're going to protect the rights, collective and individual, of everybody. And this means decolonization of colonial structure, and it means democratizing or undoing authoritarian regimes in the Middle East.
That's great. I'm going to turn it over to Safwan to take some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Peter. I mean, really fascinating discussion, and could listen on for a long time, but we do have limited time and a number of questions. So I'm going to try to synthesize as much as I can, and Peter, maybe you and I can do that together. There are a number of questions also that reflect perhaps a dichotomy between looking at the state of Israel and the condition of Israeli Arabs or Palestinian citizens of Israel versus what we refer to in terms of the West Bank and Palestinian territory and the Bantustans that you were referring to Layla. So I'm going to ask Peter maybe to look through some of those. I see a number of questions from Diana Nasser that perhaps you could try to address yourself, or maybe bring to Layla and to Bashir. So there are questions that have to do with the normalization between some Arab states and Israel, right? The Abraham Accords. And questions about, if these are driven by common interests between colonial and authoritarian states, why has it taken so long? Obviously, geopolitical interests have shifted over time. And what does this say about other Arab authoritarian regimes, and would you expect that more of them would join the fold? And let me add a third part to that that's coming from me, and that is, what are the implications for identity, the question of identity, which is really at the heart of your book, right? And it goes back to my introductory remarks in terms of Palestinian identity versus an Arab identity. What are the implications for that? And either of you is welcome to take this. Layla?
I mean, our book is not really so much about identity as much as about rights.
Sure.
I say it so that actually wanting to embrace a more cosmopolitan, a more rich Arab identity that is important to know. The implication of how do we go beyond what we have right now. I think the major change, that why it happened now, is because of the failure of the two-state solution. I think that's it. The reason why if normalization between Arab countries and Israel is happening right now is because it's been 25 years trying to implement the two-state solution, and the two-state solution went nowhere. And we have a new generation of leaders who are much more focused on the state survival than on the larger definition of what is Arab identity and Arab rights. And we also see very clearly what was occulted, what was hidden in the 1970s, how the state logic overcomes the collective national identity. Ba'athism did betray the ideals of Arab nationalism. We knew that, but now it became much more blatant. But it was a good ideology that could unite people together. Now it's being dismantled. So I think the fact, it's an admission that Arab nationalism failed, that Arab nationalism did not deliver, which we knew already since 30 years, but this is the final, if you will, the emperor is without clothes. So the question becomes, how do we go from here? And there where I see what this book does, and also what these debates are, invite us to engage in a more open dialogue about national identity and political identity, but one that needs to be ethically based. It's not a question of normalizing because we like Jews. It's a question of on what basis you're normalizing, and for what do you normalize? Do you normalize to maintain the power of a certain class, or do you normalize because you dealt with the injustices and you want to deal with the injustices, or because you're decolonizing? So I think that's what's happening in my view.
Thank you, Layla. Bashir?
No, I actually read your question in a different way than Layla did. And I think there is a very serious component that has to do with identity in this project, but in the following way. I mean, there is a very serious call of interrogation here. I mean, one of the things that is very difficult to come when you speak about identity, this kind of, very serious transition from an imperial order that existed in this region, that really dealt in a certain way with certain diversities that existed in the region, to this nation state, or the national order that has this nation state. And these nation states are very problematic in their drawing of boundary, their artificial making, and their enterprise of state building and nation building, which again, we need to be also fair to this critique of Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism is not one label. There are different variants. Ba'athism is not, so there is many things in here. But definitely one of the things that we try to do in this book is actually, to challenge and interrogate these kind of, identities that seems to be at the basic structure of these nation states constructively, discursively. And in that sense, actually, this is why, for instance, the Arab Jew, the way we deploy it, based on the work of colleagues such as Ella Shohab, is a very interesting entry to interrogate, investigate, and question, for instance, Iraqi nationalism, that actually speaks about this Iraqi identity that overlooks. Now, obviously, Iraqi identity is not reduced only to Arab Jews or Iraqi Jews, but also there are very serious diversities within that. So what it stands today, and Layla in that sense is right, that actually the question of identity is intimately tied to this question of right. Whereas today there is a very serious sentiment in the Arab world where we are going, without being declared as such, to very serious liberal discourse that speaks about individual rights, etc., etc. In the context of Israel-Palestine, and by this I finish, I think the Palestinians are a little bit more careful to go into this question of, these questions of liberal rights or one person, one vote, simply because in the case of the Palestinians has achieved the remarkable achievement that they managed to rewrite themselves back into history as a national group. Now, to ask the Palestinians to give up that for the favor of liberal rights of individuals is suicidal, obviously. This is why we introduced the idea of bi-nationalism. And this is why we need to be very careful to shift from these two states to something else, because the two-state is extremely critical in one understanding. It failed, is demising, is actually killed by the Israeli colonial enterprise, etc. But there is one thing that the Palestinians are very careful, not to do, and that is to subscribe to individual rights of liberal, benign neglect, sameness politics, where actually overlooks decades of denial, colonial denial, misrecognition, negation by the Zionist movement, the State of Israel, and some Arab regimes. So this is why, again, bi-nationalism is the relevant entry here, because bi-nationalism secures to the Palestinian what is the most important achievement of their national movement. The most important achievement of their national movement, despite the serious critique we have and the failure of our leadership at this current historical moment, is that they managed to rewrite our national movement and revolution, managed to rewrite Palestinian nationalism back on stage as a fact today. My father's generation, your father's generations could not walk out there in the world and say, I am Palestinian without being challenged. Today, you are not being challenged about your identity largely. So these are things that we need to be. Now the question is, and by this I finish, that where partition meant that the Jews are external to the Palestinians, the colonial enterprise made the Jews and the Arabs inseparable. It made the Jews are part and parcel of the Arab. And this is why any form of constellation will have to relate to identity in a very complicated way rather than binary, dichotomous form of identities that is attached to essentialism.
Right, and this is what I mean, and amongst the Arabs, you have many Jews, absolutely, and there is such a thing as Palestinian Jewish, right? I mean, and that I think in some progressive young circles is actually having some traction. So all of these things are interrelated. Peter, I wonder if you wanted to address some of the questions or field them.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that's here that I also wanted to bring out which is in the book, is also this question of the role of Islamism. It seems that when you were interrogating in the book the failure of the Arab uprisings, and one of course the issues was this split over whether what role the Muslim Brotherhood should play, and I think that this is kind of one of the odd things that happened during the Trump era was that on the one hand, you had this rhetoric about the Muslim Brotherhood emerging as a way of denying rights of Muslims in the United States, at the same time that this language about the Muslim Brotherhood as terrorists was being pushed by various Gulf regimes, and then in addition to that, some sense that that there were some minority groups in place like Egypt, for instance, that were actually so afraid of Islamism that they were actually more comfortable with an authoritarian regime than they were with one that had a free election if it brought an Islamist party to power. So I wonder if you can just bring in this question of Islamism a little bit and how it interacts with the other subjects in the book.
So one way to look at it this way as also that, part of what we try to do in this book is really challenge these comprehensive ideologies. So, I mean, with the failure of Arab nationalism or certain variants of Arab nationalism, Islamism came up as the ideology that cements or that offers the alternative to think. And again, Islamism is a very wide spectrum of ideas as well. We cannot really lump all of these Islamist kind of variants under one. But for that sake, also they kind of failed to deliver when it came to issues of like really dealing with these types of diversities with their own societies. And one of the most important challenges that face today, and I think Safwan has written about Tunisia in a very interesting way. I mean, one of the things that really face today, the Islamist, whatever that is, okay? Because again, these are not one thing. Also this question of diversity and these questions of rights and these questions of social justice and these questions of identity. Therefore, to come as the entry of Islam is the only and the most exclusive entry is also under serious interrogation and questioning. Because at the end of the day, if you were to grant rights, there are diversities that cannot be overlooked and Islam cannot be cementing them. And if Islam can be looked as the entry to cement everything, then the door becomes very wide open for what are the interpretations of Islam that you seem to be suggesting there. And in that sense, Muslim Brotherhood failed miserably to capture these complexities and to cater for them in a way that would make them much more appealing and much more accepted by the larger perspective. And I think, again, this is why there has been very serious work, at least at the level of theory, to which extent these kind of Islamist movements, at least these kind of pragmatic, so-called pragmatic type of Islamist movement, are also facing this very, very serious question that is also the diversity. And the diversity can be religious and that can be sectarian and it could be ethnic and it could be national. Because, for instance, in North Africa, you have the Amazigh and you have the Arabs, you have, there are many diversities that I think, and what this book tries to say, and by this I finish, is basically to say we need to have the courage to put these questions forward. And there is no way for forward perspective without really putting these questions on table, facing them and understand that this nation state of enterprise in the way of state building, seeking homogeneity and purity, whether that homogeneity and purity is national or Islamist, for that sake, religious, is really very, very oppressive, very, very exclusionary, and abide to actually what Israel seems to be posing as an example, or for that sake, Iran, which is basically ethno-national vulgarity of some sort that actually comes very costly without obviously comparing, closely to these cases. Israel remains to be a settler colonial enterprise. The state of Iran is a completely different story. But nevertheless, their drive for these kind of, ideology that is comprehensive, that actually leaves very little spaces at all for diversity, regardless what that diversity is. And this is why I think the book seems to be an invitation. And again, this book is not an exhaustive point. It's just kind of a collected kind of efforts that was based in the Bunun-Kreisky Forum in Vienna. So, but it is an invitation. It calls for putting this different agenda. It's a different grammar. We call it different grammar. I mean, Layla was alluding that Palestinian nationalism is undergoing a very serious labor of rethinking and redefinition. At the crux of that redefinition is the issue of partition, but also the issue of the Jews becoming internal to the Palestinian, because partition meant divorce. The Jews is external. Now, if you want to transcend partition, then the Jews become internal, and the Jews are already internal to the Palestinians by factor of geography and many other factors.
Wow. Thank you. I mean, this is, if I may say, and Peter also referred to the Nakba and the Holocaust, which you talked about, Bashir, as well, which is another book that you published with an Israeli Jewish author, Amos, and
Amos Goldberg, yeah.
Yeah. And with this book, with Layla and Bashir, it's also a compilation of great chapters and essays written by a diversity of people that represent sort of the kind of diversity that we're talking about over here. So you have Palestinian citizens of Israel, you have Jewish Israelis, you have American Jews and people like Layla, Palestinians living in the United States who have contributed to this work. And in it, I found something that is reminiscent of the Holocaust and the Nakba. Two things, actually, that I think I just want to underscore in closing. One is hope, really hope, because in an invitation to a conversation, one finds hope, right? It is when one tries to insist on one narrative over another, or on one perspective over another, is when that could very quickly lead to a loss of hope. So there is an invitation in the book, like you said, Bashir, to further the discourse. And the second thing, which is also incredibly hopeful, is the insistence on looking at history and facing that history, and dealing with the past, in order for us to be able to understand the present and move in a very positive way toward the future. And your insistence on a lot of the shared histories, right, of the Arab, the Palestinian, the Jew. And in that, I think there's also tremendous hope. So I thank you for this, and really invite everybody into this incredibly important conversation. And we don't have to always agree on everything, right? But it is an invitation to discuss and to look at the past. Peter, thank you. You're so incredibly incisive and insightful in your questions, and you helped us a great deal. And I want to give you the final word to close this out.
I just wanted to give you thank you all for giving me the opportunity. I learned a tremendous amount for the book, and I have to say, there is something for me very, as I mentioned before, very not just intellectually challenging, but also very moving about watching Palestinian scholars and intellectuals grapple with Jewish identity, because I sometimes think that they may sometimes have insights that we as Jews may need ourselves, that we may not always be able to seeing that. And I also as the grandson of someone who was born in Egypt, who was never willing, and I frankly would have responded very negatively had someone called her an Arab, even though to the people around her, her Arabness was often quite evident, no more so than to her Ashkenazi in-laws, who saw her as nothing more than an Arab, as nothing if not an Arab. This work of reconciliation, which I've always struggled with since my early days, is also something that means a great deal. So I'm very grateful to both of you for writing the book, and I hope everyone will read it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you very much. And thank you to our audience.